So I don't know about you, but the last two talks give me a whole lot of encouragement that this idea that Vermont is leading in sustainability actually can move us forward in a pretty profound and positive way, because we have essentially deep thinkers who are at the early stages of their life in business and in sustainability practices, and that's an exciting outcome. So my goal here is to talk a little bit about where we sit as a country in relationship to the biggest environmental challenge we face, which is, I think, climate change. How many of you recognize that the America has been a climate change laggard? How many of you don't think that's the case? Great. So I don't have to explain to you that we failed to sign the Kyoto Protocol, that we failed to pass any kind of meaningful climate change legislation, that we have been waiting for China to guide us in what we should do next, that we have essentially failed deeply as a global leader in something that ought to be an area that we currently excel in. So you've all seen this chart. This is carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere, beginning the Industrial Revolution, 250 parts per million. Now we're up to 390 parts per million. We're adding 1 part, 1.5, 2 parts per million per year as we continue to accumulate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what is the source of that carbon dioxide? Most of what we hear is that it is about fossil fuel burning for energy use. It is about industrial processes. The other half of that equation is, now everyone, I want to see you take a deep breath. Exhale. Did everyone do that? Okay, so you've just contributed to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The good news about Vermont is that we are essentially a carbon sink. We have more farms and forests capturing our carbon dioxide and putting it to good use than most places in the planet. So part of this thing I was just guiding you in was recognizing that carbon dioxide creation is also a natural process. Nature does it all the time through respiration. It also does it through the burning of fuels and the decomposition of organic matter. Bill Gates' talk at the TED February 2010 conference was Energy Innovating to Zero. He offered some really healthy perspective, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, in recognizing that this accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere is a fundamental problem. It's leading to increased temperatures. It's leading to significant negative effects. And we must find a way, as we move towards 400 parts per million and 450 and 500, or wherever we're going to end up, or as we try to imagine Bill McKibben's, let's go back to 350, wherever we are on that, we have some fundamental challenges which can only be met by imagining that the energy that we produce as humans, that the emissions we produce as humans, will get us down closer to zero. Bill Gates in his talk talked about these negative effects, including ecosystem collapse, climate disruption and change. He mentioned disease increases. He mentioned hunger. But I want to offer a perspective that Lester Brown, who is the founder of the World Watch organization and is really one of the leading thinkers in figuring out where we're going from an environmental economic balance, his comment in a recent Scientific America article was the #1 issue for global stability is in fact hunger and famine risk in poor countries. We saw that a couple of years ago where we had essentially increasing fuel costs, more biofuels produced by corn and such crops being diverted to energy production, and we had some real challenges happening globally in terms of the access to calories in those countries. So I want to anchor the idea that these negative risks have some real challenging perspectives and impacts that relate to my conversation here. So what Bill Gates did in his TED Talk was offer a very interesting and helpful perspective on the idea that there is an equation that we can use to get to zero. He said 4 parts to this equation, and as you'll remember from algebra, any one of these parts at zero and the whole equation goes to zero. So how do we get greenhouse emissions, carbon dioxide emissions to zero? Well, will we have zero people? No, we're not going to do that. So in fact, we have a expected 40% increase to 9 billion people in the next century. How about services per person? The demand that these people have for what they need, their transportation, their lighting, their energy. That's expected to go up by a twofold, not only because of population increase, but also because we essentially have increasing wealth in poor countries. That's probably generally a good thing. So we're going to have an increase in that as well. We get to some positive news as it relates to E, which is the amount of energy per service demanded. And in that area, we're seeing energy efficiency, we're seeing new kinds of transportation efficiency, we're seeing lighting efficiency. We're seeing changes in the amount of energy produced such that we might get a 3 to 6 times reduction in that E. So even if you take P times S times E, you're still at a 50% increase, which is the point he made. So the only choice we have to get to zero, if we're talking about energy emissions, is on the C side. So, and C is the carbon dioxide per unit of energy required. And in this area, he said there's 3 possible areas of miracle. One is carbon capture and storage. The whole idea that carbon going into the atmosphere from our production of energy or industrial processes, that we can pressurize it, we can liquefy it, and we can put it somewhere. A, very costly. B, that somewhere would be about the size of Lake Champlain every year. A lot of space required. And C, how do we know that that's ever going to become stable? So that is an issue that I think is uncertain. His second area was nuclear. He's investing billions of dollars in a technology which is not nuclear as we know it, but rather using the 99% of nuclear fuel that is a waste product and figuring out how to employ that for nuclear reaction energy generation. You know, Godspeed to him. I hope he can do that. Big cost, big challenge. And the other area is in renewables. He said there's wind, there's thermal solar, and there's solar photovoltaics. Each of these have their own challenges associated with it. The wind and the sun are not always on. How do we store that over time? There's a cost associated with it. But these are his areas of miracle. My comment to him is I think he forgot about an area of miracle that is available to us all right now, which is the whole idea that there are carbon sinks out there that have the potential to do some of the work we're imagining needs to be done in the reduction of carbon emissions. And I want to talk a little bit more about how that looks and how that works. So in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by source that are human caused, we all know that there's these energy emissions in the red and the yellow and the pink, which is about 2/3 of our emissions. But there's this other part of emissions which are in the green areas, which are non-energy emissions. This is what nature emits. And this kind of emission comes from what? Deforestation, dewatering wetlands and peatlands. It comes from soil erosion. It comes from industrial farming practices. It comes from feedlot animal production. This area, we can have some impact here to reduce the emissions by simply being smart about from deforestation to avoided deforestation, from dewatering wetlands and peatlands to rewatering wetlands and peatlands, from soil erosion to soil enhancement. These are things we can do. That would reduce the carbon emissions, but there's another part of this equation, which is how can these same lands be encouraged to sequester more carbon or other lands that have been degraded over time? Ratan Lal from Ohio State University has done a lot of analysis in this area. He's probably the leading soil carbon scientist, maybe in the world. And he basically has said, we can take the degraded soil on the planet and we can develop a program that could sequester 50 parts per million over the course of the next century. So if we're trying to get back down to 350, if we were just to do that right now from 390, we would be able to do that by sequestering carbon in that way. Let me tell you a little bit more about this idea of carbon in our whole system. And this is sort of a balance sheet and an income statement, Rocky, for the carbon economy. We have three places that carbon is stored: in the ocean, in vegetation and in soils, and in the atmosphere. The smallest of these is the atmosphere. 2 or 3% of our total carbon is stored in the atmosphere. That's where all the challenge of climate change happens. Now you also have fluxes back and forth here. So if you look at the building on the right, that is human-caused carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes, about 6 gigatons per year. The ocean is storing about 90 gigatons per year and emitting about 88 gigatons per year. So we have a net positive of 2 gigatons per year. Vegetation and soils are generating a net positive about 1 gigaton per year. Dr. Ratan Lal again said, we can imagine that the capacity for improving soils, improving degraded soils, could actually store up to 1 gigaton per year. So let's go back and look at Bill Gates' equation again. Carbon dioxide, here's how he wants to get to zero. It's all about the energy that we are consuming. It's not about the possibility that we have a net increase in carbon dioxide sequestration available to us. And that's really the thing that I want to focus on for a second here. This chart basically says we have man-made carbon going into sinks and man-made carbon as a source going up and that we need to deal with. The black line shows essentially our fossil fuel industrial process consumption. The red line shows the balance of that as we see more and more emissions going into the atmosphere. The blue line is the ocean. The ocean absorbs 1/4 to 1/3 of all of the carbon we put into the atmosphere right now, which is good news in a sense, but I'll talk about why that's challenging in a second. And then the green line is the land, the plants and the soil, which over time has been an emission source as we took the prairie and made it cropland, as we cut down forests. But it also has the capacity to move into being more of a carbon sink. The challenge of that is this idea of creating a carbon sink from land sequestration has a fertilization effect. And what happens is we are increasing the sequestration because we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, allowing plants to essentially generate more quick photosynthesis. The ocean challenge is that there's only so much carbon that the ocean can successfully absorb. And in the last decade, we've seen that amount decline by about 10%. The ocean is not going to be an area we can increase our carbon sink focus on. However, maybe land can be. The challenge with land, as this graph shows, is that as we move forward and we effectively are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into land-based systems, we actually are going to reach a point where as temperatures rise, the activity in the microbial action in the soil increases, which actually digests organic matter more quickly, and we see increase in the carbon dioxide emissions. So there'll be a point, everything else being equal, that in fact land is no longer going to sequester a net gigaton per year. It's going to start emitting. The strategy I really want to talk about that Bill Gates neglected is this idea that we can be strategic with land as a resource as we think not about only the existing land that is sequestering carbon, but actually we think about taking the degraded land over time and having a bigger impact. So let's just talk a little bit about healthy ecosystems. You can't maybe see all of these, but this essentially is in various kinds of ecosystems: peatlands, wetlands, boreal forests, tropical forests, grasslands, etc. How carbon is stored below the ground and above the ground. These are healthy ecosystems. In fact, in the United States, we have lost 2/3 of our organic matter in most of the ecosystems that are going to be the best carbon sinks. We've also lost about 1/3 of the biodiversity overall in the country, and we've lost about 2/3 of our water resources are distressed in some way or another. So a healthy ecosystem would actually have the co-benefits of water, biodiversity, food security kinds of things. And that's really the opportunity that I think we're on the verge of right now, if we can shift some of our attention to not just reduced emissions from burning fossil fuels, but actually reducing the emissions from what happens in our land base and figuring strategically how we can increase emissions from what happens in our land base. The strategy of doing that is interesting, because what Bill Gates talked about is carbon capture and sequestration, big capital cost. He talked about nuclear, big capital cost. He talked about renewable, varied capital cost, but a cost. A lot of the strategies related to being an active player in having a positive impact on ecosystem sequestration of carbon emissions is really about what Michael Schulman was talking about, a decentralized local economy. Because what are we talking about? We're talking about new kinds of agricultural tillage, low-till, conservation till, no-till. We're talking about cover cropping. We're talking about taking biosolids and compost and adding it to the soil. We're talking about agroforestry. We're talking about new strategies of pasture management and grazing animals. We're talking about drip irrigation systems. We're talking about common sense solutions that are available to really thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of businesses who could participate in that. What we need is a systematic change to invite that kind of perspective to happen. So the message overall is we need to begin to recognize that there are a lot of ways we can improve how we treat the land. We talked about that earlier, and that improvement process will actually reduce the emissions that are 1/3 of our current emissions in terms of the carbon economy. But in addition to that, we can look at an active process that we participate in. That last slide I showed you was looking at various healthy ecosystems. Each of those ecosystems has an opportunity, if we have the right policies and incentives and tax framework and cap and trade system, to advance those points of view. I don't know that we have an advocate like a Bill Gates or an Al Gore or Bill McKibben in this area, and I'm concerned about that. My experience in this is in two areas specifically. One is in the whole area of, I work in Costa Rica. I work on land in Costa Rica, partly that was 50, 60, 70 years ago, the forest was cut down, carbon was emitted. Cattle was brought in, it degraded the land, carbon was emitted. The cattle industry no longer became viable because Argentina was a cheaper place. The globalization process took that cattle industry away. What you have is no forest, depleted pastures. What do? You consciously look at how to take that resource and figure out if there is a way to sequester carbon. In this case, it is reforestation. Globally, reforestation is a big solution, particularly if we're talking about degraded ecosystems. So in this particular case, this is a product made in Costa Rica from trees that were put on cattle pastures that are now sequestering carbon by those trees growing. The concept, in fact, is sustainable forestry, so that we can look at those trees becoming a resource flow for not only sequestering carbon, creating healthy biodiversity, but also producing wood that we can then hopefully put in products that last a long time if the product is well made. The second example I'll talk about is, this is in the Intervale. We started 20-some years ago a compost project. We compost hundreds of thousands. We have composted hundreds of thousands of tons of organic waste. And that waste has been used in local farms, in gardens. It's been used to restore the Intervale. One of the ingenious things I think we did is found a way, working with Ben and Jerry's, to package it in little pints and send our waste around the country and invite people to pay a little bit for our waste as we then share with them the wealth of carbon sequestration. But take a deeper look at this process of making compost. When we got to the Intervale, there was a 1 to 1.5% carbon content in the soil of the Intervale. For every 1% additional amount of carbon in the soil, you store about 60,000 gallons of water per acre. We've increased that by 3 to 4%, so we're storing about 250,000 gallons of water per acre in the Intervale. That's not only makes irrigation easier, it also is something that enhances biodiversity. Because frankly, the richest place of life on Earth is in the soil. Now, I'm not saying that the bald eagles that are now nesting in the Intervale are because we have life in the soil, but I think there's a link there to this whole system that we're talking about. Third benefit is that if you look at the analysis on organic farming, you can reduce your costs for the kind of farming we do in the Intervale by 50% if you bring enough fertility, natural organic fertility, into the soil. You can increase your output by 10%. So you're reducing your costs, you're increasing your output. Going back to that point I began with, where Bill Gates said, if you look at services and the energy required to provide services, the one place where he said energy cost for service is really hard to manage is industrial agriculture. I disagree with that. I think there's a lot of room for change. We have to reimagine what's possible. And the idea of taking waste, making it fertility, storing it in the soil is a great model of that. The final area is back to Ratan Lal again, Ohio State University, where he said, if we consciously store, if we consciously build and restore the soil that's been degraded, we can take 50% of the carbon emissions out of the atmosphere and put it into that improved soil. And we can take 50% of the emissions that we're likely to see going forward and put it into that soil. So going back to our net 3 gigatons challenge, perhaps up to 1.5 gigatons, or half of that challenge, can be sequestered as we also improve our soil and have those other benefits of biodiversity, productivity, water storage, etc. Going back to the original title of my whole talk. So my final comment is really there is a lack of political understanding or will, and we were on the verge last fall. The House passed climate change legislation. The Senate was getting close, and then we had disaster after disaster after disaster to get in the way of making this happen. I hope that we can find a way that our energy and climate change legislation can recognize the power and importance in cap and trade, or whatever other strategy we choose as the way to reduce carbon, to increase sequestration as a way of increasing the health of our ecosystem. And equally and just important is the Farm Bill, that the next Farm Bills go in 5-year cycles. We need a 50-year Farm Bill. This is what Wes Jackson is promoting, if you know his work in the Land Institute. This is critical because we cannot create a process of increasing fertility, protecting our soils long-term, unless we have a long-term view. And this idea of a farm bill that recognizes the increase in fertility in the soil, recognizes the value of perennial grains that Wes is working on, is going to be necessary. So you as voters, you as advocates, those are 2 key opportunities for advocating for what I was promoting at the beginning. A second solution to the climate change challenge, which has a whole host of co-benefits. Thank you.